In November 2023, a publicly traded American media company shut down the Las Vegas Strip, poured $500 million into a race it promoted itself, and generated $1.5 billion of economic impact over a single weekend, making it the largest sporting event the city had ever staged. Just 8 years earlier, that same company's sport hadn't been able to sell its American television rights for any meaningful sum at all, and when ESPN picked them up in 2018, it was reportedly for free. By 2026, Apple was paying roughly $150 million a year for those same rights, part of a 5-year deal worth around $750 million in total. So that's the trajectory. From nothing to 9 figures a year, inside less than a decade. And the thing that actually explains it wasn't a car, or a driver, or even a race. It was a television show that the sport's 2 biggest teams refused to appear in. Picture a balding, sweary Italian-American team boss, red-faced in a cramped garage, days from a payroll he isn't sure he can make. That image, aired to millions of people who had never watched a Grand Prix in their lives, stirred something so powerful that it explains a meaningful chunk of why Apple is now paying what it's paying. This is essentially the story of how Formula One, a 70-year-old European institution with an aging audience and a business model built for a world that no longer existed, ended up being rescued by a streaming documentary it had commissioned almost as an afterthought. Netflix didn't set out to save Formula One, and Formula One didn't expect it to. But Drive to Survive managed something that no rule change or marketing budget had managed before it. It turned a sport into a story people actually wanted to keep following. To understand why that worked, it helps to first understand exactly how broken the underlying business had gotten. By the mid-2000s, Formula One looked, at least on paper, like one of the biggest sporting properties on Earth. Hundreds of millions of cumulative viewers, 20-odd races a year, and a global footprint the NFL could only dream of. But a footprint doesn't pay dividends on its own. Demographics do. The NFL, confined almost entirely to a single country, was generating several times F1's revenue, essentially because it owned the exact audience advertisers wanted to reach. The Premier League, despite a fraction of F1's history, had turned itself into a genuine global media product. Formula One, meanwhile, had drifted into something closer to a museum. The American numbers made this especially clear. In the largest sports media market on the planet, F1's television audience averaged around 500,000 viewers a race, while NASCAR's championship finale alone was pulling in over 4 million. And the average F1 viewer kept getting older every year, with younger fans not arriving to replace them, largely because the sport had made itself close to impossible for a young person to stumble across in the first place. Bernie Ecclestone, who ran Formula One for 4 decades, was once asked directly why the sport did so little to court younger fans.
"I'm not interested in them. Young people haven't got any money. I'd rather have the 70-year-old with the Rolex than the 17-year-old with a phone."
That particular piece of logic is worth holding on to because it resurfaces later. In its own way, Ecclestone's Formula One was a genuinely effective business. He took a fractious collection of racing teams and turned them into a rights-selling machine, extracting race-hosting fees from governments desperate for prestige and television money from whichever broadcaster paid the most, while reinvesting almost nothing back into the product itself. That made him, along with the private equity firm CVC that owned the sport alongside him, extraordinarily wealthy. It also hollowed the sport out from the inside. Races kept migrating to pay television because pay television paid more, and audiences shrank correspondingly. Digital was treated less as an opportunity than a threat. Fans who uploaded race clips were routinely chased off the internet by copyright lawyers, and for years, social media access was effectively restricted in the paddock. Further down the grid, that extraction carried a real human cost. By 2016, teams like Manor and Sauber were financially desperate. with drivers arriving carrying sponsor money stitched to their overalls just to keep the lights on, mechanics going unpaid for stretches, and roughly half the grid sitting one bad season away from disappearing entirely. There wasn't really a US growth strategy, because in Ecclestone's version of the sport, there didn't need to be one. America had come and gone from the calendar for decades, remembered mostly for a farcical 2005 race in Indianapolis where only 6 cars actually started. The deal that ended his run was agreed in September 2016 and closed the following January. Liberty Media, an American company controlled by cable billionaire John Malone, bought Formula One at an enterprise value of $8 billion, of which about $4.4 billion was equity. Filings later showed that Liberty had actually committed barely $300 million of its own cash to complete the purchase. Ecclestone was given the title of Chairman Emeritus, a role he later admitted he'd never even heard of, and one that came attached to no real power at all. The museum, in other words, had new owners. It still needed visitors. Liberty's publicly stated plan was to fix the racing itself. Better cars, closer competition, a cost cap, fan festivals, more overtaking. Improve the product, the thinking went, and the audience would follow. That, however, isn't really what saved Formula One. What saved it was a side project so minor that the sport's 2 biggest teams didn't even bother taking part in it. In 2018, Liberty signed off on a fly-on-the-wall documentary series with Netflix, produced by Box to Box Films. Nobody involved treated it as a centerpiece of anything. Reports at the time suggest Netflix paid a fairly modest fee for access, essentially pocket change against the sport's billion-dollar media contracts. 10 episodes following the 2018 season released the following spring, and almost immediately the project ran into what looked like a fatal problem. Ferrari said no, Mercedes said no. The 2 teams actually contesting the World Championship, the ones with the biggest drivers and the trophies and the entire sporting narrative attached to them, simply refused to let the cameras anywhere near them. The show's executive producer was fairly candid about how that felt at the time.
I think the 2 biggest teams did the sport and its fans a disservice by staying out.
His production team, though, ended up doing something more useful than complaining about it. They went and found the story somewhere else on the grid. Denied access to the front of the field, the cameras headed for the midfield instead, to the strugglers and underdogs fighting over 8th place. That's essentially where they found Gunther Steiner, a sweary, exasperated, endlessly quotable Haas team boss, presiding over feuding drivers, sackings, and a fairly constant state of low-grade crisis. What the cameras had actually stumbled onto wasn't really a motorsport at all. It was a workplace drama that happened to involve 200-mile-an-hour cars. So the very thing that should have killed the show, losing Ferrari and Mercedes entirely, ended up being what made it work. Forced away from the podium, the cameras found people instead. The purists did have something of a point, to be fair to them. Drive to Survive isn't really a documentary about racing so much as a soap opera built out of racing footage. Timelines rearranged, rivalries amplified, radio messages dropped into races they never actually belonged to. Max Verstappen reportedly refused direct filming for a stretch, calling parts of it manufactured, and plenty of longtime fans dismissed the whole thing as a cartoon, loudly enough that for a moment it looked like the backlash might actually cost the show its new audience before that audience had properly settled in. It didn't cost them much of anything in the end. The people watching had never particularly cared about race purity to begin with, and what happened over the following seasons made that fairly obvious. The real question was never whether the purists would come around. It was whether the millions of new viewers Drive to Survive had pulled in would actually stick around, or whether this was just a one-season Netflix novelty that would fade once the algorithm moved on to something else. Take Lando Norris as one data point. In 2019, he was a 19-year-old rookie that essentially nobody outside the paddock could pick out of a lineup. Had this been a passing fad, he'd likely have stayed that way. He didn't. By 2025, He had nearly 12 million followers on Instagram, more than most NFL franchises' own team accounts manage, and teenagers who couldn't have named a single constructor were now lining up for his merchandise. That's admittedly one driver, though. The more useful test is whether the shift held at scale, and by 2025, the sport's own global fan survey found that among new American fans, nearly half were between 18 and 24, and more than half were women. Ecclestone's 17-year-old with the phone had shown up after all. Millions of them, and they hadn't left. The audience data backed this up season over season. The American TV average of roughly 500,000 viewers in 2018 climbed past 1 million from 2021 onward, reaching a record 1.5 million for the 2025 United States Grand Prix, the largest domestic F1 audience on record, with 17 of 19 races that year posting year-on-year growth. Austin was joined on the calendar by Miami in 2022 and then Las Vegas in 2023, where Liberty stopped licensing races out to third-party promoters entirely and simply built its own, spending $500 million to own the event outright. Once it was clear the new audience wasn't going anywhere, the money stopped being cautious. Those US television rights that had reportedly gone for nothing in 2018 were re-signed by ESPN at somewhere around $85 to $90 million a year by 2023. Then in October 2025, Apple outbid them entirely. 5 years, roughly $150 million a year, announced just after Apple's own Formula One film cleared $600 million at the box office, making it the highest-grossing sports movie ever released. So the fad question was more or less answered. What was left was a different one. Who actually got paid for all of this? Let's start with who pays. American broadcasters, whose rights fees went from nothing to 9 figures inside 8 years. Blue-chip sponsors, companies like American Express and Oracle, chasing the young, affluent audience the show had delivered. Governments and cities, still handing over 9-figure fees just to host a race weekend. And the new fans themselves, buying tickets at prices that made Las Vegas the most expensive sporting weekend in America. Then there's who actually profits, which is a longer list. Gunther Steiner, for one, whose Haas contract wasn't renewed after 2023 and who came out of the whole experience more famous than most of the drivers he'd managed, selling out book tours and landing sponsorship deals a midfield team boss would never normally expect. Liberty Media, whose $4.4 billion equity purchase now sits inside a business worth many times that figure. The teams themselves, all 10 of which are now valued above $1.6 billion, averaging $3.4 billion in 2025, trailing only the NFL and NBA among all professional sports leagues globally. McLaren, which lost $137 million in 2018 alone, saw its outside investors bought out in 2025 in a deal reported as a 10 times return, apparently the largest exit any institutional fund had ever made from a sports team. Even Haas, the smallest operation on the grid and the underdogs of that first season, went from financial afterthought to a billion-dollar-plus franchise in under a decade. The drivers profited too, though in a currency Ecclestone never seems to have accounted for: fame. Daniel Ricciardo's on-track results faded even as his celebrity grew, and by the end he was arguably more recognizable outside the car than most world champions ever were inside one. Drivers stopped being anonymous names on a timing sheet and became protagonists instead, essentially influencers with millions of followers and sponsorship fortunes to match. Ecclestone had said young people didn't have any money. He was, it turns out, looking at the wrong ledger entirely. What they had instead was attention, and attention, packaged correctly, converts into almost anything. None of this means the underlying business has become immune to gravity, though. Las Vegas, the supposed crown jewel of the new strategy, saw its economic impact fall by more than a third in its second year, and Liberty's own executives have acknowledged the race missed internal expectations. Drive to Survive itself is showing signs of fatigue too, 7 seasons in, its novelty largely spent. And the growth engine now sits behind Apple's paywall, a platform with a fraction of the reach that ESPN's free-to-air and cable coverage once had. A sport that got saved by being effortless to stumble across has, somewhat ironically, just made itself considerably harder to find. Add a full regulation reset arriving in 2026, new cars, and an 11th team in Cadillac, and Formula One is essentially about to find out whether its new fans came for the racing or just for the show around it. Every legacy sport has more or less absorbed the same uncomfortable lesson by now. The product was never really the product. The racing itself barely changed between 2016 and 2021. The same Mercedes cars won almost everything the entire way through. What changed is that strangers were finally given a reason to care. Golf, tennis, cycling, even NASCAR have all since commissioned their own Drive to Survive style shows, and most have quietly discovered that the formula doesn't transfer particularly well because F1 had something none of them do: a closed paddock, genuine hostility, and 20 drivers effectively trapped inside 10 pressurized marriages. The soap opera was already there. Netflix just happened to find the door into it. Liberty, for its part, read its own ledger and drew the obvious conclusion. In 2024, it agreed to buy MotoGP for around $4.5 billion, an aging European series with passionate fans, next to no American audience, and no television show of its own. It's not hard to guess what happens next. Because in modern sport, a $500 million race down the Las Vegas Strip doesn't actually start with an engine. It starts with a camera, a struggling team, and a man from Haas swearing about his drivers. We asked essentially this same question about the FIFA World Cup: who actually pays and who actually profits, and found a ledger just as buried as this one. If you haven't seen that breakdown yet, it's linked below and pinned on screen right now, and it follows the money all the way to the fans footing the bill. If you liked pulling back this particular curtain, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This channel opens a new ledger every week. Next, we're opening the biggest one yet. 115 charges, a decade of silence, and the club accused of buying football itself. That verdict's still coming. We'll be there when it drops.